ang nakapangingilabot na kagutuman noong AD 70.
Flavius Josephus, original name Joseph ben Matthias, born AD 3738 Jerusalem, died AD 100 Rome, Jewish priest, scholar, and historian who wrote valuable works on the Jewish revolt of AD 66 to AD 70 and on earlier Jewish history. Taking the fifth book of the history of Josephus again in our hands, let us go through the tragedy of events which then occurred. For the wealthy, he says, it was equally dangerous to remain. For under pretense that they were going to desert, men were put to death for their wealth. The madness of the seditions increased with the famine, and both the miseries were inflamed more and more day by day. Nowhere was food to be seen. But bursting into the houses, men searched them thoroughly, and whenever they found anything to eat, they tormented the owners on the ground that they had denied that they had anything. But if they found nothing, they tortured them on the ground that they had more carefully concealed it. The proof of their having or not having food was found in the bodies of the poor wretches. Those of them who were still in good condition, they assumed were well supplied with food, while those who were already wasted away they passed by, for it seemed absurd to slay those who were on the point of perishing for want. Many indeed secretly sold their possessions for 1 measure of wheat if they belonged to the wealthier class, of barley if they were poorer. Then, shutting themselves up in the innermost parts of their houses, some ate the grain uncooked on account of their terrible want, while others baked it according as necessity and fear dictated. Nowhere were tables set, but snatching the yet uncooked food from the fire, they tore it in pieces. Wretched was the fare, and a lamentable spectacle it was to see the more powerful secure an abundance while the weaker mourned. Of all evils, indeed, famine is the worst, and it destroys nothing so effectively as shame. For that which under other circumstances is worthy of respect, in the midst of famine is despised. Thus women snatch the food from the very mouths of their husbands and children, from their fathers, and what was most pitiable of all, mothers from their babes. And while their dearest ones were wasting away in their arms, they were not ashamed to take away froth them the last drops that supported life. And even while they were eating thus, they did not remain undiscovered, but everywhere the rioters appeared, to rob them even of these portions of food. For whenever they saw a house shut up, they regarded it as a sign that those inside were taking food, and immediately bursting open the doors they rushed in and seized what they were eating, almost forcing it out of their very throats. Old men who clung to their food were beaten, and if the women concealed it in their hands, their hair was torn for so doing. There was pity neither for gray hairs nor for infants, but, taking up the babes that clung to their morsels of food, they dashed them to the ground. But to those that anticipated their entrance, and swallowed what they were about to seize, they were still more cruel, just as if they had been wronged by them, and they devised the most terrible modes of torture to discover food, stopping up the privy passages of the poor wretches with bitter herbs, and piercing their seats with sharp rods. And men suffered things horrible even to hear of, for the sake of compelling them to confess to the possession of 1 loaf of bread, or in order that they might be made to disclose a single drachm of barley, which they had concealed. But the tormentors themselves did not suffer hunger. Their conduct might indeed have seemed less barbarous if they had been driven to it by necessity. But they did it for the sake of exercising their madness, and of providing sustenance for themselves for days to come. And when anyone crept out of the city by night as far as the outposts of the Romans to collect wild herbs and grass, they went to meet him. And when he thought he had already escaped the enemy, they seized what he had brought with him. And even though oftentimes the man would entreat them, and, calling upon the most awful name of God, adjure them to give him a portion of what he had obtained at the risk of his life, they would give him nothing back. Indeed, it was fortunate if the one that was plundered was not also slain. To this account Josephus, after relating other things, adds the following. The possibility of going out of the city being brought to an end, all hope of safety for the Jews was cut off, and the famine increased and devoured the people by houses and families, and the rooms were filled with dead women and children, the lanes of the city with the corpses of old men. Children and youths, swollen with the famine, wandered about the marketplaces like shadows, and fell down wherever the death agony overtook them. The sick were not strong enough to bury even their own relatives, and those who had the strength hesitated because of the multitude of the dead and the uncertainty as to their own fate. Many indeed died while they were burying others, and many betook themselves to their graves before death came upon them. There was neither weeping nor lamentation under these misfortunes, but the famine stifled the natural affections. Those that were dying a lingering death looked with dry eyes upon those that had gone to their rest before them. Deep silence and death-laden night encircled the city, but the robbers were more terrible than these miseries, for they broke open the houses, which were now mere sepulchres, robbed the dead and stripped the covering from their bodies, and went away with a laugh. They tried the points of their swords in the dead bodies, and some that were lying on the ground still alive they thrust through in order to test their weapons. But those that prayed that they would use their right hand and their sword upon them, they contemptuously left to be destroyed by the famine. Every one of these died with eyes fixed upon the temple, and they left the seditious alive. These at first gave orders that the dead should be buried out of the public treasury, for they could not endure the stench. But afterward, when they were not able to do this, they threw the bodies from the walls into the trenches. And as Titus went around and saw the trenches filled with the dead, and the thick blood oozing out of the putrid bodies, he groaned aloud, and raising his hands, called God to witness that this was not his doing. After speaking of some other things, Josephus proceeds as follows. I cannot hesitate to declare what my feelings compel me to. I suppose, if the Romans had longer delayed in coming against these guilty wretches, the city would have been swallowed up by a chasm, or overwhelmed with a flood, or struck with such thunderbolts as destroyed Sodom. For it had brought forth a generation of men, much more godless than were those that suffered such punishment. By their madness indeed was the whole people brought to destruction. And in the 6th book he writes as follows. Of those that perished by famine in the city, the number was countless, and the miseries they underwent unspeakable. For if so much as the shadow of food appeared in any house, there was war. And the dearest friends engaged in hand-to-hand conflict with one another, and snatched from each other the most wretched supports of life. Nor would they believe that even the dying were without food, but the robbers would search them while they were expiring, lest anyone should feign death while concealing food in his bosom. With mouths gaping for want of food, they stumbled and staggered along like mad dogs, and beat the doors as if they were drunk, and in their impotence they would rush into the same houses twice or thrice in 1 hour. Necessity compelled them to eat anything they could find, and they gathered and devoured things that were not fit, even for the filthiest of irrational beasts. Finally they did not abstain even from their girdles and shoes, and they stripped the hides off their shields and devoured them. Some used even wisps of old hay for food, and others gathered stubble, and sold the smallest weight of it for 4 Attic drachma. But why should I speak of the shamelessness which was displayed during the famine toward inanimate things? For I am going to relate a fact such as is recorded neither by Greeks nor barbarians, horrible to relate, incredible to hear. And indeed I should gladly have omitted this calamity, that I might not seem to posterity to be a teller of fabulous tales, if I had not innumerable witnesses to it in my own age. And besides, I should render my country poor service if I suppressed the account of the sufferings which she endured. There was a certain woman named Mary, that dwelt beyond Jordan, whose father was Eliezer, of the village of Bathzor, which signifies the house of hyssop. She was distinguished for her family and her wealth, and had fled with the rest of the multitude to Jerusalem, and was shut up there with them during the siege. The tyrants had robbed her of the rest of the property which she had brought with her into the city from Perea, and the remnants of her possessions and whatever food was to be seen, the guards rushed in daily and snatched away from her. This made the woman terribly angry, and by her frequent reproaches and imprecations she aroused the anger of the rapacious villains against herself. But no one either through anger or pity would slay her, and she grew weary of finding food for others to eat. The search, too, had already become everywhere difficult, and the famine was piercing her bowels and marrow, and resentment was raging more violently than famine. Taking, therefore, anger and necessity as her counselors, she proceeded to do a most unnatural thing. Seizing her child, a boy who was sucking at her breast, she said, "O wretched child, in war, in famine, in sedition, for what do I preserve thee? Slaves among the Romans we shall be, even if we are allowed to live by them. But even slavery is anticipated by the famine, and the rioters are more cruel than both. Come, be food for me, a fury for these rioters, and a byword to the world. For this is all that is wanting to complete the calamities of the Jews." And when she had said this, she slew her son, and having roasted him, she ate one half herself, and covering up the remainder, she kept it. Very soon the rioters appeared on the scene, and, smelling the nefarious odor, they threatened to slay her immediately unless she should show them what she had prepared. She replied that she had saved an excellent portion for them, and with that she uncovered the remains of the child. They were immediately seized with horror and amazement and stood transfixed at the sight. But she said, "This is my own son, and the deed is mine. Eat, for I too have eaten. Be not more merciful than a woman, nor more compassionate than a mother. But if you are too pious and shrink from my sacrifice, I have already eaten of it. Let the rest also remain for me." At these words the men went out trembling, in this one case being affrighted. Yet with difficulty did they yield that food to the mother. Forthwith the whole city was filled with the awful crime, and as all pictured the terrible deed before their own eyes, they trembled as if they had done it themselves. Those that were suffering from the famine now longed for death, and blessed were they that had died before hearing and seeing miseries like these. Such was the reward which the Jews received for their wickedness and impiety against the Christ of God.
Narito nga ang mga babala sa kanila ng Panginoong Hesus bago pa ito mangyari noong AD 70, ang paghuhukom ng Diyos.
But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city. Because these are days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled. Woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. Luke chapter 21, verse 20 to 23. But Jesus, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us." Luke chapter 23, verse 28 to 30. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Matthew chapter 24, verse 15 to 19. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Matthew 24, verse 34.
Ayaw pa ba nating maniwala sa mga katotohanang isinasalaysay ng Biblia na pinatutunayan rin ng kasaysayan? Hindi ba tama ang kasulatan sa mga sinalita ng Panginoong Hesus noon sa kanila? Na siya ay magbabalik sa henerasyong iyon, hindi sa katawan, kundi para sa paghuhukom at pagliligtas. Ginanap na ngang lahat ang nasusulat, walang naiwan. Sapagkat sa kanila ipinangako, sa kanila tinupad. Ganito katotoo ang Diyos sa Kanyang salita.